purpose of all that was to make the point that there are three forms of worker ownership. Minority employee share plans, as we have in First Group, workers' cooperatives, as we have in SUMA and CycleWorks, and then employee ownership or co-ownership, as we find in John Lewis. Very shortly, I'll show you in a little bit more detail how these types of model differ. And just as a kind of prelude to that, the main areas they differ in are the proportion of the firm owned by employees, the distribution of ownership between employees, the governance structures used, and the rationale for ownership. But before I tell you a little bit more about that, just let me tell you a little bit more about what I've been up to. Most of my research has been on minority employee share plans and employee ownership or co-ownership. I started off in the 1990s working on fully employee-owned firms at Bradford University, along with Nick Wilson and later Andrew Robinson. In fact, it's Nick Wilson who started me off on this. So Nick, you bear a lot of responsibility here. The 1990s was an interesting time because employee ownership, majority employee ownership, was starting to take off in a big way. And what we tried to do was make sense of what was going on, looking at the variety of employee-owned firms, looking at the different governance structures that we use, and also looking at whether employee ownership was associated with more favourable employee attitudes, as the theory predicted. Towards the end of the 1990s, I became interested in minority employee share plans, which, as we'll see, are far more widespread than full-blown employee ownership. Looked at the factors influencing employee involvement in these plans, and indeed whether employees invest too much. Along with Andrew Robinson here tonight, we've looked at the productivity outcomes of these plans. One of the highlights for me, as Alistair mentioned, was being a member of the Inland Revenue, as it then was, advisory group, led by Diane Hay here on the front row, with a remit to develop the first led government's legislation to extend employee share ownership plans. Recently, I've started to go back to look at full employee ownership again. And what's been really interesting is that the profile of the sector has changed quite markedly in 15 years. And of course, has grown a great deal as well. Things that have occurred in the intervening years has been the development of a much more supportive infrastructure for majority employee ownership. We have a good, well-functioning trade association in the Employee Ownership Association. Director Patrick Burns is here tonight. And there is a specialist venture capital and advisory body for the sector, the Baxi Partnership. I think there are one or two people here from Baxi tonight. I'm delighted that you're all able to make it. So let's go on to these three forms of worker ownership. Starting with minority share plans, as you can see, the amount of ownership of a company, they use the laser gun for the first time, is very small, typically, usually not more than 5%. The investor trade associations tend to discourage anything more than 10%. Although there are some free shares arrangements which get shares to everybody, many of the plans in use are subscription-based, so participation tends to be partial and unequal, with, on the whole, better off employees being more likely to participate. On the whole, this form of share ownership doesn't give any involvement in governance beyond normal arrangements. And the rationale for for this form of ownership is typically to align employee interests with the firm. Now, I should say this form of ownership is quite widespread. I think in 2008 there were about 1,400 firms with an all-employee plan. It was revealed last week that 7.3% of British households are either shareholders through this route or hold employee share options. Most of the FTSE 100 will have one or more of these plans, and a majority of the FTSE 350. Save as you earn probably has been the main plan over the years. About 500,000 people entered a SAYE invitation last year. Moving on to workers' cooperatives, there's a lot fewer of them. Probably about 350 at the moment, with an average of 10 employees. They do have 100% ownership, and ownership is usually equal. One person, one vote, one membership right. Strong emphasis on worker management and worker control, and a strong philosophy on cooperation and personal development, reflecting the principles of the Rochdale pioneers back from the 1840s. Workers' cooperatives have perhaps had not such a good press in recent years because there's been a tendency for them to be associated with the co-ops from the last years of the Callaghan government. Triumph in Meriden, KME in Liverpool and the Scottish Daily News, which perhaps slightly unfairly was seen as failed organisations. And then finally, full employee ownership or majority employee ownership. Anything from 25 to 100% owned by employees, with often managers making up the difference. Ownership is sometimes equal, sometimes it's unequal. Governance structures vary widely. Some have worker directors, some have partnership councils, some have very conventional forms of governance. And the rationale for it differs as well. We'll come on to that. I'm going to be looking mainly at this form of employee ownership for the remainder of the talk.